Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2020-2021 In-Print Margaret Root Brown Reading Series, our 40th season. This wasn't how we envisioned celebrating it, but here we are, and we are thrilled to be here tonight in the In-Print virtual studio with award-winning novelist Yaa Gyasi, who will read from and talk about her marvelous new novel, Transcendent Kingdom, and then join in conversation with novelist Waiyetu Moore. We owe great thanks to Yaa for being with us tonight, as well as Knopf, her publisher, and Waiyetu, our wonderful interviewer. My name is Rich Levy. I'm Executive Director of In-Print, and we are happy and grateful that you are with us for this 40th anniversary season, a testament to the people of Houston and the power of the written word. Since 1980, this literary series has presented nearly 400 great writers from 36 countries, winners of 9 Nobel Prizes, 63 Pulitzer Prizes, 56 National Book Awards, 51 National Book Critics Circle Awards, 16 Booker Prizes, as well as 19 U.S. Poets Laureate, in a series that is accessible to everyone. Thank you all for keeping the candle burning. The next few weeks of the In-Print Brown Reading Series will be fast and furious. 2 weeks from tonight, on October 5th, we're thrilled to present renowned novelist Marilynne Robinson with her new novel, Jack, the 4th installment in her Gilead series. She will be in conversation with her former student, novelist physician Chris Adrian. A week later, on October 12th, the great novelists Julia Alvarez and Sigrid Nunez will join with us with their new novels, Afterlife and What Are You Going Through? And then in November, we'll have evenings with Nick Hornby and Margaret Atwood, in February with Lily King and Chang-Rae Lee, and in April with Viet Thanh Nguyen and our old friend Jericho Brown. Season tickets will be available through the end of this week. New this year, our premium 40th anniversary season subscription, which includes books by all the featured authors in the series shipped to you, signed or with signed book plates with possible. Tickets and details about all of this and more are at inprinthouston.org. To those who've purchased season tickets this year already, thank you so much for being such great champions of the series. In addition to the In-Print Margaret Root Brown Reading Series, mark your calendars for our first ever virtual In-Print Cool Brains series, which starts October 11th with a visit from Lois Lowry, author of The Giver, Number the Stars, with her new book, The Willoughbys Return. Cool Brains is our series for middle grade kids. Registration for our online fall In-Print Writers Workshops is underway, with space available in many 4 to 6 week classes. We also offer In-Print free workshops across the city for senior citizens, school teachers, healthcare providers, veterans, the incarcerated, and others. Normally, we present readings in Spanish at In-Print House, which will soon go live on Zoom. And the In-Print Poetry Buskers typically write poems all over town by request in English and Spanish on typewriters, but not at the moment. It's a great time to check out Inkwell, our podcast with Tintero Projects that highlights Latinx writers, and the In-Print Archive of Readings, which houses recordings of more than 100 past readings. Another thing that continues unabated is our support for some of the nation's top emerging authors at the UH Creative Writing Program and undergraduate writers at Rice. All of this and more is at inprinthouston.org. The In-Print Margaret Root Brown Reading Series is made possible by the invaluable support of the Brown Foundation and is named for one of its founders. The series is also underwritten by the National Endowment for the Arts. In-Print receives generous support from the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, the Jerry C. Deering Family Foundation, Houston Endowment, and Texas Commission on the Arts. Now, the way this will work tonight is that for about 10 minutes, Yaa will talk about and read from Transcendent Kingdom, and then she will join novelist, and former Houstonian Waitu Moore for a 35 to 40-minute conversation. Before I introduce Ya, I want to do one more thing. Please buy this terrific book at brazosbookstore.com. Houston's beloved indie bookseller and our partner in this series since 1980, Brazos is offering a 10% discount on Transcendent Kingdom. Excuse me. The discount code of all things is INPRINT, which you enter at checkout, brazosbookstore.com. Yaa Gyasi's debut novel, Homegoing, received many accolades, including the PEN/Hemingway Award, the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Award, and the American Book Award, among others. Born in Ghana and raised in Huntsville, Alabama, Gyasi was inspired to pursue a career as a writer after reading Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and receiving a certificate of achievement signed by LeVar Burton for her very first story submitted to the Reading Rainbow Young Writers and Illustrators Contest. I love that. A National Book Foundation 5 under 35 honoree. She holds a BA in English from Stanford and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. According to Publishers Weekly, Yaa Gyasi's new novel, Transcendent Kingdom, at once a vivid evocation of the immigrant experience and a sharp delineation of an individual's inner struggle, brilliantly succeeds on both counts. Ron Charles in the Washington Post calls the novel a book of blazing brilliance, of profound scientific and spiritual reflection that recalls the works of Richard Powers and Marilynne Robinson, a double helix of wisdom and rage twists through the quiet lines. Thank God we have this remarkable novel. The Seattle Times sums it up: a luminous, heartbreaking, and redemptive American story. Transcendent Kingdom is the mark of a brilliant writer who is just getting started. Please welcome Yaa Gyasi. Yaa, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rich, for that introduction. That was lovely. Thank you to INPRINT for having me. I'm excited to open this season. Thank you all for joining me tonight. I know these are strange and difficult times, and I really appreciate that you're spending your evening with me. And thank you to Waitu for being the moderator for tonight's event. I'm going to start with just to tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'll do a reading, and then we'll be in conversation. So Transcendent Kingdom is a novel that follows this woman named Gifty, who is getting her doctorate in neuroscience at Stanford University. And it's at a time in her own life when her mother, who is quite depressed, has come to stay with her. Her research focuses on addiction and depression, namely the neural pathways of reward-seeking behavior. Gifty spends the time conducting her research, approaching her final thesis, while also reflecting on her childhood, particularly the years that led up to her beloved older brother's death from a heroin overdose. So she is a character who is reticent, guarded, brilliant, and curious. And we follow her for all of these pages as she kind of struggles through, grapples with these relationships in her life and in her family. And I'm just going to read from the very beginning, so don't worry about spoilers. And yeah, thanks again. Whenever I think of my mother, I picture a queen-sized bed with her lying in it, a practiced stillness filling the room. For months on end, she colonized that bed like a virus. The first time when I was a child, and then again when I was a graduate student. The first time, I was sent to Ghana to wait her out. While there, I was walking through Kejetia Market with my aunt when she grabbed my arm and pointed. "Look, a crazy person," she said in Twi. "Do you see a crazy person?" I was mortified. My aunt was speaking so loudly, and the man, tall, with dust caked into his dreadlocks, was within earshot. I see, I answered in a low hiss. The man continued past us, mumbling to himself as he waved his hands about in gestures that only he could understand. My aunt nodded, satisfied, and we kept walking past the hordes of people gathered in that agoraphobia inducing market until we reached the stall where we would spend the rest of the morning attempting to sell knockoff handbags. In my 3 months there, we sold only 4 bags. Even now, I don't completely understand why my aunt singled the man out to me. Maybe she thought there were no crazy people in Alabama or in America, that I had never seen one before. Or maybe she was thinking about my mother, about the real reason I was stuck in Ghana that summer, sweating in a stall with an aunt I hardly knew, while my mother healed at home in Alabama. I was 11, and I could see that my mother wasn't sick, not in the ways that I was used to. I didn't understand what my mother needed healing from. I didn't understand, but I did. And my embarrassment at my aunt's loud gesture had as much to do with my understanding as it did with the man who had passed us by. My aunt was saying, that is what crazy looks like. But instead, what I heard was my mother's name. What I saw was my mother's face, still as lake water, the pastor's hand resting gently on her forehead, his prayer, a light hum that made the room buzz. I'm not sure I know what crazy looks like, but even today, when I hear the word, I picture a split screen, the dreadlocked man in Kejitia on one side, my mother lying in bed on the other. I think about how no one at all reacted to that man in the market, not in fear or disgust, nothing, save my aunt, who wanted me to look. He was, it seemed to me, at perfect peace, even as he gesticulated wildly, even as he mumbled. But my mother, in her bed, infinitely still, was wild inside. The second time it happened, I got a phone call while I was working in my lab at Stanford. I'd had to separate two of my mice because they were ripping each other to bits in that shoebox of a home we kept them in. I found a piece of flesh in one corner of the box, but I couldn't tell which mouse it came from at first. Both were bleeding and frenzied, scurrying away from me when I tried to grab them, even though there was nowhere to run. Look, Gifty, she hasn't been to church in nearly a month. I've been calling the house, but she won't pick up. I go by sometimes and make sure she's got food and everything, but I think it's happening again. I didn't say anything. The mice had calmed down considerably, but I was still shaken by the sight of them and worried about my research, worried about everything. Gifty, Pastor John said, she should come stay with me. I'm not sure how the pastor got my mother on the plane. When I picked her up at SFO, she looked completely vacant, her body limp. I imagined Pastor John folding her up the way you would a jumpsuit, arms crossed about the chest in an X, legs pulled up to meet them, then tucking her safely into a suitcase complete with a handle with care sticker before passing her off to the flight attendant. I gave her a stiff hug and she shrank from my touch. I took a deep breath. Did you check a bag? I asked. Debbie, she said. Okay, no bags. Great, we can go straight to the car. The saccharine cheeriness of my voice annoyed me so much I bit my tongue in an attempt to bite it back. I felt a prick of blood and sucked it away. She followed me to my Prius. Under better circumstances, she would have made fun of my car, an oddity to her after years of Alabama pickup trucks and SUVs. Gifty, my bleeding heart, she sometimes called me. I don't know where she'd picked up the phrase, but I figured it was probably used derogatorily by Pastor John and the various TV preachers she liked to watch while she cooked to describe people who, like me, had defected from Alabama to live among the sinners of the world, presumably because the excessive bleeding of our hearts made us too weak to tough it out among the hardy, the chosen of Christ in the Bible Belt. She loved Billy Graham, who said things like, "A real Christian is the one who can give his pet parrot to the town gossip." Cruel, I thought when I was a child, to give away your pet parrot. The funny thing about the phrases that my mom picked up is that she always got them a little wrong. I was her bleeding heart, not a bleeding heart. It's a crime shame, not a crying shame. She had a little southern accent that tinted her Ghanaian one. It made me think of my friend Anne, whose hair was brown, except on some days when the sunlight touched her just so, and suddenly you saw red. In the car, my mother stared out of the passenger side window. I tried to imagine the scenery the way she might be seeing it. When I'd first arrived in California, everything had looked so beautiful to me. Even the grass, yellowed, scorched from the sun, and the seemingly endless drought had looked otherworldly. This must be Mars, I thought, because how could this be America too? I pictured the drab green pastures of my childhood, the small hills we called mountains. The vastness of this Western landscape overwhelmed me. I'd come to California because I wanted to get lost, to find. In college, I'd read Walden because a boy I found beautiful found the book beautiful. I understood nothing, but highlighted everything, including this. Not till we are lost, in other words, not till we have lost the world, do we begin to find ourselves and realize where we are and the infinite extent of our relations. If my mother was moved by the landscape too, I couldn't tell. We lurched forward in traffic, and I caught the eye of a man in the car next to ours. He quickly looked away, then looked back, then away again. I wanted to make him uncomfortable, or maybe just to transfer my own discomfort to him, and so I kept staring. I could see in the way that he gripped the steering wheel that he was trying not to look at me again. His knuckles were pale, rimmed with red. He gave up, shot me an exasperated look, mouthed, "What?" I've always found that traffic on a bridge brings everyone closer to their own personal edge. Inside each car, a snapshot of a breaking point. Drivers looking out toward the water and wondering, what if? Could there be another way out? "Are you hungry?" I asked my mother, finally turning away. She shrugged, still staring out of the window. The last time this happened, she'd lost 70 pounds in 2 months. When I came back from my summer in Ghana, I had hardly recognized her, this woman who had always found skinny people offensive, as though a kind of laziness or failure of character kept them from appreciating the pure joy that is a good meal. Then she joined their ranks. Her cheeks sank, her stomach deflated. She hollowed, disappeared. I was determined not to let that happen again. I'd bought a Ghanaian cookbook online to make up for the years I'd spent avoiding my mother's kitchen, and I'd practiced a few of the dishes in the days leading up to her arrival, hoping to perfect them before I saw her. "We're here," I said, rushing to help my mother get out of the car. She walked a little ahead of me, even though she'd never been to this apartment before. She'd visited me in California only a couple of times. "Sorry for the mess," I said, but there was no mess, none that my eyes could see anyway. But my eyes were not hers. Every time she visited me over the years, She'd sweep her finger along things it never occurred to me to clean. The backs of blinds, the hinges of doors, then present the dusty, blackened finger to me in accusation, and I could do nothing but shrug. Cleanliness is godliness, she used to say. Cleanliness is next to godliness, I would correct, and she would scowl at me. What was the difference? I pointed her toward the bedroom, and silently, she crawled into bed and drifted off to sleep. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ya. That was lovely. Appreciate it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Wayétu Moore. Wayétu is author of the novel She Would Be King and the memoir The Dragons, the Giant, the Women, released in June 2020, which documents her family's escape from Liberia when she was 5, her years eventually adjusting to life in Houston, and her return to Liberia as an adult. She is founder of One More Book, a nonprofit that creates and distributes culturally relevant books for underrepresented readers. Wayétu, we're very, very grateful you're with us tonight and associated once again with Houston. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me, for the invitation, Rich. I cannot wait to attend an imprint in person once we're back to normal day, as they would say. And yeah, thank you for this book. Thank you for this book. There's so many things that I want to talk about and cover while we're here. I think the instinct, obviously, because this book is somewhat of a departure, not in the ways that people think from your last book. And so the instinct is to do somewhat of a comparative examination of the work, right? And I'm going to try to avoid that because I think I look at that as akin to comparing children. I would hate if people compared me to my sisters or asked my mother how we differed. There's only one component of the two that I did want to cover, and that's historical fiction versus contemporary fiction. You know what I mean? So one dealing with Africans in America yesterday and generations ago, and then this one dealing with Africans in America, their assimilation, and the various things that families experience today. And I am really interested in how your approach in navigating the present day differed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. I think that the research really informed both of these novels, and the research process was so different, and the things that the research required of me were so different for these books. Homegoing, as you said, is historical, and in order to write it, I needed to kind of know a little bit about a lot of different time periods, because the novel covers roughly 300 years of history. But for the most part, it was history that I was pretty familiar with, or had some kind of background in. And so the research felt almost like atmospheric. I wanted to do enough so that I felt as though I could step into the world of the characters and take off from there. So I often say that it was wide but shallow. Like, again, I just wanted to know a little bit about a lot of things in order to write the book. Transcendent Kingdom, by contrast, was totally different. It required that I learn about something that I knew nothing about, neuroscience, specifically the field of optogenetics. And so it felt like narrow but deep, like I needed to know as much as I could about this single topic that I had no grounding in. And therefore, it wasn't really an atmospheric thing. Like, it felt like a deep dive. And I think the fact that it was set in the current moment was really a boon in a lot of ways. Like, it took me less time to write this novel, which I think has something to do with my familiarity with the time period, and also kind of my ease with the family dynamics. Like, there were elements of this book that I think were really conducive to writing quickly in a way that homegoing was not. So I think the kind of my contemporary understanding of the issues that I was bringing into Transcendent Kingdom were helpful in that they just kind of informed the novel in a way that made me not have to kind of think about anything else. I could really
Right.
just devote myself to those few things that I didn't know. And in this case, it was neuroscience, it was the world of the opioid epidemic. It was depression, mental illness. So I was thinking about those three things rather than thinking about like 30 things for
Yeah.
homegoing.
Yeah. I mean, but this obviously requires, I would imagine, an intense amount of research as well. As you said, she's a scientist, she's a neuroscientist. And I'm always curious about protagonists that depart from professions in the liberal arts or academia or social sciences.
Yes.
So let me ask you, in sort of having to indulge this kind of research, was it a task or treat?
It was a
Escapism?
treat.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, it was a treat. You know, it's funny that you say that, like the interest in protagonists that aren't writers or that aren't kind of in the arts.
Mhm.
I was thinking about all the movies that you see, all the books that you read where the characters live in New York or LA, and you know that everybody involved lives in New York or LA. And in some ways, it kind of limits our understanding of the fact that this world is really wide and people do all kinds of things and live in all kinds of places, and those places deserve to be honored and represented in the same way.
Yeah.
This particular novel started because my childhood friend, a dear friend of mine from Alabama, is herself a neuroscientist.
Wow.
And around the time that Homegoing came out, she had a pretty major paper set to be published. And she's a big reader. She was really excited for me. She read the book and was, again, just like super supportive. And I thought, I want to be supportive to you too. Please send me the paper. She did. I sat down to read it and I did not understand a word of it. Like I literally could not penetrate what was happening in this paper. And so even before I decided I wanted to write about this, I just asked if I could shadow her in her lab out of curiosity and also kind of a sense of determination to better understand what she does. And she very generously said yes. So I went, and the day that I went, she was performing a surgery on her mice that I detail in the next couple of chapters from what I read there. And I just found it really fascinating and so different from anything that I spend my days thinking about or doing. And I loved this idea of kind of getting to see someone out of a context that you are used to seeing protagonists in, certainly. But for me, like getting to see my friend in a different context than what I'm used to seeing her in, I think really started the wheels turning. So that was really the genesis. I just wanted to understand her work. It almost felt like a writer's prompt of a novel, like write a book about a neuroscientist who studies addiction and depression. That was kind of what was on my mind as I was researching and working on this book.
So the profession and the research was inspired by your friend. Was the character in any way inspired by your friend as well?
No, the character wasn't inspired by the friend. The character came about, I would say, from this short story that I had written months after I finished Homegoing. I like to set the books aside between editing. So I'd finished a first draft, I was setting it aside, and I wrote this short story that I really liked the voice of. And it was about a woman named Gifty, who was a Gerard Manley Hopkins scholar whose mother comes to stay with her. And I liked this story. It was published in Guernica. I, sent it off and returned to Homegoing, and then that took off, and I kind of forgot all about it. But when I started thinking about Transcendent Kingdom, thinking about the work that my friend did, I remembered that voice, and I remembered that situation more than the voice. The idea of a woman who is now deeply intellectual, having to care for and find common ground with a mother who doesn't kind of speak the same language, a mother who like speaks in the language of faith and religion, and is tied deeply to a culture that the woman is kind of growing out of or growing away from. So that was kind of the genesis for the character of Gifty.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. It's a good segue too, as you're talking about a culture that she is growing out of or probably doesn't feel totally at home with, because I did want to spend time talking about the cognitive dissonance of being African in America and then African American, you know, or at least someone with African American sensibilities, because the character is raised here as a Black woman, of course. So one of the things I loved about this book is that the story is about an African immigrant family, and it's not wholly centered around their immigration, right? It is very much about what happens, what really, really happens after the move. What are the functions and what's the results of that assimilation? Like that's the thick of it, and that's I think a lot of what you cover here, and that's why I love this book so much. So for instance, there are instances in the book, particularly in Alabama. I mean, obviously they're in Alabama, where the family is experiencing pretty blatant racisms, both explicit and implicit. And one of the things that stuck out to me as somebody who is also African American, with African American sensibilities, who also identifies as African American, is how you wrote the family as, or how they dealt with some of this. Some of it was willfully ignoring what was happening, crediting it to something else, age, etc., focusing on their religious duties over just like the human dignity of sticking up for yourself. There's someone who said this really racist thing. And then I was in a space where a part of me like cringed when I read, like, for instance, even in the beginning, when the man is referencing the N-word very close, in close proximity to Gifty's mom, and even calling them explicitly monkeys. And then you're writing this, it's a sort of admission to how Africans in America negotiate racism, and how that negotiation does differ from how an African American character or protagonist or family in Alabama would. And I want to talk about the process of writing as a sort of admission to this reality, right? Especially during this time when racism and awareness of racism in America is the topic. What was that process like for you?
Yeah, this is a subject that really interests me, and one that I'm often kind of circling in all of my work, in great part because I grew up in very similar circumstances to Gifty's, not quite the same environment, but a similar one. And I feel like Gifty is a character who is isolated in so many different ways. Her family immigrates to America, but she knows no other country herself. She's never been to Ghana before this trip that you hear about at the beginning of the book. And when she goes under duress. She goes under these difficult circumstances. Her mother is healing at home. Her brother has just passed away, and so her relationship to Ghana is already fraught. And within that, there's the further relationship of her family, her parents, who are, her mother in particular, who is guarded, not particularly emotionally available to her children, and also rather secretive. So Gifty never gets this kind of understanding or education around her culture, where she comes from. All she knows is her family in Alabama. And this is further complicated by the fact that her mother has plopped them down into the predominantly white part of Alabama. So she's negotiating ethnicity, but she doesn't have a connection to her ethnic background. She's negotiating race, but she doesn't have access to other examples of what race in America might look like. She's a character who is walking this kind of this tightrope and doing so with very little help and very little understanding, cultural understanding. And so this book is partly a process in getting to see her start to make these connections, understand these moments in her life that she just kind of accepted as, this is just what happens. Understanding those things as, oh, actually, that was a racist scenario, without her parents having the language to express that to her, having the language or wanting to express that to her. I think her mother in particular is in denial about some of the things that are occurring to her family. And part of this denial, I think, has to do with the fact that her mother is the one who wanted to come to America. She kind of pressured her father into coming. And when he comes, he recognizes that the American dream is a lie. He's working all the time. They're making very little money. People are atrocious to him. He finds himself being racially profiled. He finds his children experiencing racist aggression, and he decides that he doesn't want to deal with it. And so he leaves. And so I think the mother's character is operating under a few different circumstances. One is a lack of understanding just about the racial history of America in general. But two is this guilt and this shame around the fact that there is something happening that she doesn't know how to handle. She doesn't know how to talk to her children about. She recognizes their pain, but she doesn't want to she doesn't want to or know how to engage them on this particular level because it's not a level that she's had to think about before. And so she chooses not to, which is, we could talk about whether or not that's an okay choice. I think for Gifty, it really kind of messes her up. Gifty is a character who is experiencing, I think, a lot of internalized racism. I don't even know if she would call it that. I think there's a moment in the novel where she acknowledges that that's what's going on. But you have to wonder what Gifty's life would have been like, what Nana's life would have been like if they had parents who were willing to acknowledge what was going on in the lives of their children in this particular way. If they had parents who had taken them to a Black church instead of a white church, or at least a racially mixed church. If they had parents who were more willing to go back or financially capable to go back to Ghana to kind of get that fullness of community. But instead, Gifty is a very lonely character. She's isolated within isolation within isolation.
Yeah, I mean, and some of that denial comes from because you're saying all of this and you're speaking truth, and obviously I know these characters very well. Some of the denial comes from, most immigrant groups, they come here, they view America as an emerald city. And then coming here, as you said, with Gifty's father and realizing, oh, it is an emerald city, but not for everyone, right? Or maybe I have to go through extra mazes if I'm a Black immigrant as opposed to someone of another racial category. And that is a very brutal awakening for many people, right? I do think that, when you talk about the parents being reluctant to admit how that then shifts the relationships between parents and children, to the children being the teachers. Because I remember as a kid, I mean, we spent time when we were in Tennessee. Tennessee was those were the brutal years. And when we were in Tennessee, there were times when my mother would be on the phone with a doctor, electrician, whomever, and trying to make an appointment. And they would, well, what'd you say? What? And she was speaking English. So she would just give me the phone, just tell them this, make this appointment. So I was as young as 7, 8, negotiating on behalf of my mother, my father, and then later on saying things like, oh, well, that's not how it happens here. Or Mom, you can't say that. Or Mom, you can't do that. Dad, you can't say that. You can't do that. And so then how much more natural then is Gifty assuming guardianship of her mother? Because isn't this something that was already in some capacity happening throughout the story, though not explicitly.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think of this book as an examination of caretaking in a lot
Mhm.
of ways. You know, the mother's character is herself a caretaker. She works as a home health aide. She works in the homes of elderly people who need extra care. And she does this at the expense often of her own family. So she's a woman who works these long hours away from the house. And when she comes back, she has very little left to give to her children. And so from a young age, I think Gifty recognizes that kind of emotional distance and
Mhm.
feels the need to kind of overcome it. And then after her mother's first episode, Gifty is very much taking care of her mother, mothering her mother.
Mhm.
In these ways that, as you say, like that children of immigrants of all stripes end up having to do at some point when you recognize that your parents aren't quite getting the dynamics as quickly as you are forced to get them.
Mhm.
And so negotiating these distances for your parents, I think Gifty does that, but then she's also just doing the basic kind of care that we expect parents to do for children. She's making sure that her mother has eaten. She's making sure that her mother has bathed.
Mhm.
And she's doing all of this at a very young age. And so she doesn't have, I think, she grows up too fast and she doesn't have a lot of the emotional language to understand what that means. But you're right. I think it's working on these two different levels, the caretaking.
Mhm. Mhm. And like, I mean, that is very typically immigrant, because as you said, immigrants of different stripes. I have friends who are Spanish speaking who have had to translate. I think what made it probably more psychologically violent for me was because my parents were speaking English, and
Yeah.
so they, the racism was evident. It was essentially, I don't want to understand. I don't care to understand what
Hmm.
they're saying. Just have somebody who sounds more like me on the phone, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I appreciated a story that dug into those nuances, that really gave the reader a chance to explore. Well, after immigration, after the trip is made, after there is a reckoning that you must remain, then what, right?
Mm.
And I, you when you talk about the African immigrant story or any immigrant story, that is usually accepted, published, lauded by the capital C canon, you do have expectations. They're the high performing children. But
Hmm.
the other side of this arrival, post arrival, there is a lot of mental health issues, and there's addiction, right? But I think those are obviously things that we don't discuss. I think religion is a huge reason for that. I was also, I also came up in a white church, and that was,
Hmm.
I think, why my parents, in many ways, were reluctant to accept racism, because their race was Christ. If somebody's a believer, then that's their brother or sister, right?
Right.
And so religion was a reason for that. But I do think that mental illness is perceived as differently from physical illness, because mental illness, um, from the lens of religion, is seen as that somehow your soul or your mind departed from God, right?
Mm.
And a soul's departure from God, a mind's departure from God, seems somehow voluntary, where physical departure is like involuntary. So there's
Right.
definitely empathy toward people who suffer physical illness in a way that there isn't. So because of
Right.
that, you mix the religious context and the specifically West African context, and I'm pretty sure there are. I'm not pretty sure. I'm certain there are even more contexts that are specific to Ghana and the ethnic group in Ghana. But so we remain silent. Many people just remain
Mm.
silent, right?
Mm.
And when you write, when you engage in your artistry, um, do you allow those who would rather this reality remain hidden, remain asleep, become a part of the conversation? right? Is there any fear of this sort of exposure that, yes, mental illness is something that's experienced, addiction is something that's experienced, because then does that shatter the perception of the Emerald City prematurely before those who are perhaps still waiting to come would have to then reckon with?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, I wasn't really concerned about or thinking about shattering the perceptions around mental illness, or shattering the kind of rose-colored glasses with which we look at immigration to America. I was thinking about the stigmas around mental illness from a few different perspectives. One is just the religious perspective. I grew up similarly to Gifty in a church that's very much like this. And I think, as you said, mental illness is thought of in some ways as like just this thing that you can give to God and he will take care of. Like it's not necessarily, you know, we do understand the limitations when it comes to physical illness. There's still like a let's pray, but there's also like let's trust the doctor. Whereas when it comes to mental health, it's just like let's pray. You don't need the doctor, and where that line is, I think is really interesting. And what Gifty is trying to say through her work is that she's locating this in a very specific organ. She's locating it in the brain. She's, I think, arming herself with the language to tell people from the communities that she grew up in, this is an organ just like any other. When it is sick, we have to pay attention to it the way we would pay attention to a heart that is malfunctioning, a lung that is malfunctioning. The other community that Gifty comes from, as you mentioned, is obviously the West African community. And there's a moment that really interests me in the novel. In addition to that, the first chapter, which I think is playing off this idea a little bit. But Gifty mentions a study, which is a real study, that came out in 2015 that looked at schizophrenics in India, Ghana, and America. And what the study found was that the schizophrenics in India and Ghana had much better relationships with the voices in their heads. We could call them relationships at all. They thought of the voices as being these kind of benevolent voices, the voices of their families, the voices of God, the voice of God. And in America, the relationship to the voices was very different. They described it as being harsh, violent, intrusive, bombardment. And what I liked, or what I thought about this particular moment in the book, which is echoed in the beginning, is that I'm interested in the ways that culture kind of narrates our experiences with mental illness. Like if you are thinking about this not as necessarily something to pathologize, but as something that is that we should be kind of reverent about, that is a part of a person's life, that is recognizable and understandable as elements of their family, elements of their religion, then your relationship to that illness can be different. And the way you approach talking about and addressing the illness can be different. So I think Gifty is a character who is sensitive to the fact that science and culture are inextricable. She's a character who's very sensitive to kind of community-minded responses to healthcare crises. But she's also a scientist, and she wants to find answers, and she wants to heal. And I think she's a character who leaves room for both of those feelings to exist at once.
Yeah, to heal. I think that's the key word there, because there is so much to heal from. Like this is it's one of those books and one of those stories that is the menace it's silent like throughout. Like I'm reading it and there's so much tension, and I wasn't sure whether or not the tension was because I related so much to what was going on, but I think like it's just naturally, effortlessly there. I want to talk about place as well, because you know Alabama is the And you come from a place like West Africa where everyone, most everyone looks like you. And, you know, there are other systems of stratification that exist in those spaces to the South, you know, to Alabama, where, you know, you're Black. Okay, that's fine. But is it really? And that constant negotiation, it is physically or psychologically rather taxing, right? And obviously that took the ultimate toll on Nana, her brother. But I want to talk about place in two ways. One, how you imagine these characters, because we spoke about protagonists before, and how you know, stories greatly differ based on place. And so how could Gifty or Nana's story, how would it have been different if they were raised in a major city, but by the same parents, right? By the same parents. Do you think that dynamic changes at all? Because then it's like,
yes, totally.
You think so?
I do actually. I do. I'm fascinated by place, and it's something that I'm always kind of returning to. I really wanted to set this novel in the town that I grew up in, mostly because I think it's so informed who I was, who I am, in these ways that I'm still trying to kind of parse out and articulate today. But I think that there's a point where Gifty calls something that happens at her church where she overhears these two women, these two white women, make a racist remark about her brother's illness, about his suffering, and she recognizes even as a child that there's this distance that she can never cross, that she's never going to kind of be good enough to be accepted into this community that she lives in. And what she says about this moment is that it was a spiritual wound, a wound that she has spent her life kind of trying to find and address. And I think, you know, for me, as somebody who moved around quite a lot when I was a child, and we talked about this a little earlier, but I came to America when I was 2, and then we lived in Ohio, Illinois, Tennessee, Alabama. And each place, there were fewer and fewer West Africans. When we got to Columbus, Ohio, there were many, and my family was part of the African Christian Church, which was like half Nigerian, half Ghanaian. We were still doing all of the same things we were doing in Ghana, all of the outdooring ceremonies, all of the weddings, all of the funerals, the same food. It felt in many ways like a soft landing. And then by the time we got to Alabama, there was one Nigerian family that lived in Meridianville that you had to drive like 30 minutes to see, which my family did because we were dedicated to community, dedicated to West African community. I've told this anecdote before, but every time my family moved, the first thing they would do would be to grab the phone book and look up Ghanaian last names and call the person and be like, hey, we're in town. And they were very, very like committed to making sure that we retained that sense of ourselves as West African, as Ghanaian. But I couldn't help, even as a child, particularly in the Alabama years, I would do these kind of thought experiments and think, what would my life look like? What would my days be like? Who would I have become if I had stayed in Columbus? You know, if I had continued going to the African Christian Church, if I had continued to build those relationships with other Ghanaians that felt kind of even casual. Like my best friend in preschool was Ghanaian, which that feels like uncanny to me now. And the fact that I was experiencing these kind of losses that I couldn't really understand or articulate as losses when I was a child, but this diminishing community from place to place to place, I think was itself a kind of spiritual wound that I'm addressing and thinking about in my writing all the time. And so place is incredibly important to me because I think not just from the perspective of an immigrant who's losing community. I think even if you are born and raised here, the fact that a person who lives in Alabama has different politics and religious practices and and food and culture than a person who was born and raised in California, I think is incredibly interesting. And I want to explore and think about those differences and how we kind of experience and relay culture. And so I think I'm a writer who's always thinking about how place informs character, how place informs our own development.
Yeah. Well, you do it in this book masterfully. And I hope everyone who's out there who hasn't read it before reads it. It's just a wonderful, I would say, introduction to literature that I guess that would be considered African immigrant literature, because it is as I mean, I know that people have been comparing and asking the difference between the two, but it is vast in its exploration, and what you're able to achieve is just quite wonderful to read. So thank you for this. I think we're just about out of time. And thanks for the opportunity to be in conversation with you. Just keep going. I'm rooting you on, rooting for you, cheering you on, rooting for you. The language thing, right?
Yeah.
But just clapping for you the whole way. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so kind. And thank you for being here with me tonight.
Of course.
It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you both. That was great. Thank you, Wayatu, and thank you, Ya. Remember, everyone, to please buy your copies of Transcendent Kingdom at brazosbookstore.com. And don't forget the discount code INPRINT. It was absolutely a wonderful conversation. I wish we could have just gone on and on, but now you just have to read the book. We hope you will be with us for all of this year's series. Please stay tuned for further info to imprinthouston.org, where you can join the Imprint email list, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Thanks again. We'll see you in 2 weeks here at the Imprint Virtual Studio with Marilyn Robinson and her new novel, Jack. In the meantime, take care, be well, and happy reading.